Hi, good evening everybody, and welcome to the daily Rambam Shiur, lesson 115. And we will be covering the rules of Hilchos Nezirus from chapter 6 until chapter 8. Typically in our life, in order to assess how things are valuable to us, one of the ways to realizing how valuable they were at the time we are missing them or they are being damaged. We spoke in the previous lessons that what consists of Nezirus are three items: the prohibition from wine, the prohibition from cutting the hair, and the prohibition from coming in contact with dead corpse. So, though that all of them are commitments that a Nazir is obligated to fulfill, however, if for a reason those three items that he must to obey, the accident happened, he touched a dead body, he drank wine, or he cut his hair, though all of them are violations, nevertheless the way they affecting his Nezirus are totally different. While if a person even deliberately, a Nazir, drank wine, though he will be subject to punishment and lashes, yet nothing of his Nezirus were damaged. In fact, he was not missing any days of his Nezirus. When it comes to taking and cutting the hair, so whether he done it again deliberately or unknowingly, still if it was until the point of the majority of the hair are intact, he is not missing any days. In case it is the majority of the hair, they were cut in such a way that there is not sufficient space to connect between the head to the hair until the bottom of the hair, then he is missing only 30 days. And basically, he needs to wait a 30-day period until until a period of until somewhat of the hair will be growing, and then these Nezirus are normal. The only thing that really affects his Nezirus to such a way that the previous days are lost entirely, and this is when it comes to any contact with tum'o. Later on we'll see that even this type of tum'o that makes him lose the entire count of days until this point is very selective, depends what type of tum'o. Nevertheless, the harm that tum'o is doing to his Nezirus is second to none, in the sense that basically the Even Ezra, when on the Pasuk V'hayomim horishonim yiplu, he writes over there a very interesting point, that this is reflecting of a principle that mitzvah goyreretz mitzvah and aveiro goyreretz aveiro. And this mysterious statement of the Ibn Ezra have really triggered lots of curiosity by the different commentators of the Torah. What does he really means? And what he really means will be explained by a certain story that took place in the olden home, where once upon a time a Jew have done a great mitzvah of Pidyon Shvuim, and he was able to release the captive from their jail, and the rabbi of the city turns to him and he says, I'm very, very curious, what type of mitzvah have you done before this particular mitzvah that from Shamayim, from heaven, they led you to do this particular mitzvah? And basically, given the fact that the tum'o is capable, contrary to yain, to violation of wine, or the cutting the hair is able to destroy entirely the count of the previous days, shows that the same way as a mitzvah Nezirus mitzvah, and since Mishomayim they're not going to let him to be exposed to such things, so according to the Ibn Ezra, it's a reflection of a previous things that he have done that made him to deserve to receive this type of a situation. Nevertheless, as we have learned before, that he needs to go through the entire process of cutting the hair and bring the korbanos tumo and start a new count of Nezirus. However, this tiglachas is not called tiglachas tahara, it's called tiglachas tumo, and there is also different type of korbanos that he needs to bring, which typically consists of 2 birds. One of them is chatos and the other one is oilo, and the third one is a lamb for oshom. There is a difference also at what point he became Tomei. Obviously, if he became Tomei in middle of his period, so whatever we have just said is applicable. If he became Tomei after the conclusion of the days of the Nezirus, so this depends also at what point after the conclusion of the Nezirus he became Tomei, and whether he actually took the tiglachas and brought the korbanos or not. Though biblically he won't be affected, but nevertheless rabbinically, if it happened today to be in the day that he should bring the offerings, he still needs to add 30 days midirabanan. If it took place after the time that he would be qualified otherwise to bring the korbanos and take the haircut, so then he doesn't need to bring and to restart again the Nezirus. There is another exceptions where the days of previously will still be considered if he happened to become Tomei at the second day of the Nezirus. So then he is not missing this one day that he actually became a Nazir, since in the Torah it says Vehayomim, days plurally, Iplu. He will be losing the previous days plurally. At the time that there is a single day, he is not losing them. Once upon a time, in the early days when smoking in the yeshivos were still popular, but nevertheless local bands by the Rosh Yeshivas, by the staff, were introduced. So once upon a time, a yeshiva boy comes and sees his chavrusa smoking a cigarette. He turns to his chavrusa, he says, "How dare you are smoking?" He says, "Why shouldn't I be smoking?" He says, "Well, because I asked the mashgiach, I asked the Rosh Yeshiva whether I'm allowed to smoke or not, whether I'm allowed to smoke in the middle of learning," and he says, "Absolutely not." So he says, "No, it cannot be. And I will show you how to ask the question." And he goes to the yeshiva, to the Rosh Yeshiva, and he says, "Well, my question is, am I allowed to learn in the middle of smoking?" And the Rosh Yeshiva told him, "Of course you're allowed. Not only you're allowed to learn in the middle of the smoking, but you must learn in the middle of the smoking." I was thinking about this story when the Rambam actually at the first Perek present 2 types of scenario. Until now we have learned a scenario where a person who is already a Nazir, he was exposed and he clashed in a state of the tumah. The second part of the Rambam deals precisely the opposite. A person who is Tomei, he is in a state of tumah, whether he is in a cemetery, he takes upon himself Nezirus, whether the Nezirus that he takes upon himself will kick in. And the answer, yes, absolutely. the Nezirus, although he cannot functionally act as a Nazir, and obviously he cannot take those days that he is at May Mace, and he still needs to go through the process of Taharo by sprinkling upon him the water of the Pora Adumo and go to the mikveh, cannot be counted, but he is a active Nazir. And for that reason, if he will deliberately be metame himself again and again, despite the fact that people warning him not to be metame, he will be exposed to the idea of Malchus, which the Nezirus is still applicable to him. There is another implication where a person who accepted upon himself the state of Nezirus while he is in a state of atomei. So, for example, by him, while he is already bringing the korbanos of he goes through the process of tahare, so by him the 7th day, which then he is being sprinkled with the water, can be used as the first day of counting the Nezirus. Because only by a person who was a Nazir and became Tomei, only then he needs to count from the 8th day. But a person who is Tomei already, the counting by him starting at the 7th day. Also, after bringing those offerings, the bird offerings, although there is 3 offerings, but what is critical is the chatos. After he already brought the chatos, he's starting a new count of Nezirus. If for a reason he was not going to the mikveh after the sprinkling, so the count will be starting only after the tvilo in the mikveh. The location where he takes the haircut must be in the entry. It doesn't need to be the type of a haircut that he takes while he is a tumah, doesn't need to be the entry of the Beis Hamikdash, but it's optional whether he is taking the haircut inside the Beis Hamikdash or outside. The hair is prohibited to have any benefit and requires to be buried, and as any items that needs to be buried contrary to burn, so any item that is the mitzvah is to burn, I'm allowed to benefit from the ashes. But any item that the mitzvah is to bury, even for a reason it was burned instead of buried, the ashes will always stay forbidden. Also, a very important thing by a person who is a Nazir who became Tomei, though that he may be subject to many punishment and lashes if Hasroe warning took place, but as far as the korbanos tumah will never exceed the korban per each and every tumah, because while he is already in a state of tumah, as far as the korbanos, the offerings that he needs to bring for the tumah, will never gonna exceed from the original amount. If a Nazir went through the entire process of purification and turns out that he was Tomei and he just discovered the fact that he is Tomei, should retroactively I will annul and cancel the previous days? And answer depends what type of tumor. There is one type of tumor which is called tumor yadua, a non-tumor. If the tumor is known, so therefore the same rules as we have introduced before. V'hayomim horishonim iplu, the previous days are cancelled and he needs to start a new count, are applicable to this as well. However, if it was tumas hatehoim, and the definition of a tumas hatehoim, that no one in the world had any awareness about this type of tumo, so halocha leMoshe miSinai, I won't require him to restart a new count of Nezirus. There is, to these exceptions, another exception as well. If a person actually was in a state of tumo, and turns out that this particular tumas hatehoim was laying or floating in the mikveh where he was dipping in order to purify from his tumo, at that time he will be considered tomei. And the reason is because when there is a current status, in order to remove an individual from a current status, which in this case the status is a status of tumo, the only way when there is certainty that he is actually tohir. As long as there is no certainty, he will remain in the state of tumo. This is basically a summary of the 6th chapter of Hilchos Nezirus, which is the first chapter of the Rambam of today. The 2nd chapter makes a major distinction between the types of tumo that will be able to cancel the previous days, as we have just learned before, and tumois that not necessarily will destroy and cancel the previous days of tumo. And typically, in order to become tomei by tumas meis, is via A, 3 ways: or by mago, direct contact; B, maso, carrying; C, oihel. Oihel being under the same tent with the tumo, or you are becoming the tent over the tumo, or the tumo becomes the tent over you. Those are the types of 3 ways a person becomes a tomei meis. However, there is a specific list which part of the corpse will trigger a tumo. The general idea, there is certain measurement about the flesh, about the blood, about the bones, and sometimes even when there is a decomposed form of the dead person subject to many conditions, will trigger a tumo. However, and this is basically a list of 12 items which will qualify to put a nozir in a state of tumo, which will he have to be megaleach and start a new count. There are certain restrictions that although he will be a tomei and he will have to go through the process of purification, which typically is a 7 days period, which is associated with getting sprinkled with the afer of the red heifer. Nevertheless, and in those particular days won't be able to consider it part as the Yemei Nezirus, but the previous days are not going to be cancelled. He will still be able to maintain those count of the previous days. What are those exemptions? Typically are rabbinical restrictions of tumo. For example, if his entire tumo derived from the fact that he stepped in Chutz La'aretz, outside Israel, which is a rabbinical form of tumo, or in a field that a kever, a grave, was plowed in it, or it was a decomposed body which contains 2 bodies which were not qualified according to the parameters that will have to be megaleach. Or that there was not a sufficient amount of bones out there or sufficient amount of blood. In all those situations, as we have said, though he will be Tomei, but nevertheless he is not missing the previous count. There is very interesting rule that, according to the definition of the Rambam, is an expression of mercy that we had on the Nozil, that, for example, if he was touching a utensils who touched the mace, though that for a normal human being he will be exposed to the process of taharo, however a nozil will be exempt even from hazoeh in shlishi and shvi. And the Rambam explains that the reason is a special consideration to the fragile and sensitive state of a nozil. The end of the chapter deals with a overlap between a person who is a nozil and he became a metzoiro. A metzoiro is a leopard, which again, in order to determine that he is a leopard, there is two stages. There is a stage of hesgel, quarantine, that is made in order to determine whether the proper sign which will define him as a metzoiro will appear. So therefore he is not a muchlot, he is called metzoiro musgo, that is only in a state of a standby. And then there is a metzoiro which is muchlot. So obviously the times of the tzoras quarantine cannot be counted as the days of his Nezirus, though they are not breaking his Nezirus, but they cannot be counted in the fact that he is Nezirus. So he is not a functional nozil, but he is an active nozil. And the reason is because if, for example, he at the time of his tzoras will go and touch a dead person, I may be under the impression that since these days are not considered to be part of Nezirus, so it should not cancel the previous days. Comes the Rambam and Mechadesh and tells us a chidush that despite the fact that he is not a functional nozil, given the fact that he is an active nozil, so his previous days will be cancelled and he will have to restart a new type of counting of a new Nezirus. There is one chidush which is called a mes mitzvah. A mes mitzvah is a person who died and there is nobody who will take care of his burial. So though a nozil is forbidden to come in touch with dead bodies, in such a case he is committed to violate his restriction and take care of the dead bodies. If a person, another situation, if a person, a nozil, not a nozil, a person took upon himself a oath that he will drink wine, and then he decided he wants to be a nozil, so he is committed to violate his oath, because same way as a nozil, when he takes upon himself Nezirus, just by definition he will be violating the mitzvah of drinking wine of Shabbos by Kiddush and Havdolo, and this is part of the Nezirus which overrides the previous commitment. So same way as there is a commitment that is being violated by Nezirus legally regarding the Yain Kiddush, the wine of Kiddush or Navdolo, so an oath to drink wine is being viewed precisely on the same level, and he should go ahead and violate his previous oath. We spoke before about a mes mitzvah. It's a person who there is nobody available to bury him, and even then I will treat priorities. For example, if there is a Nazir, two types of Nazirim are going on the way. There is one of them is a Nazir with expiry date, and the other one without an expiry date. So the person with the expiry date Nazir, a term Nazir as opposed to a permanent Nazir, is a lighter level of Kedusha. He should be the one who will take care of the dead body rather than the person who is a temporary Nazir. If a Kohen and a Nazir, even a Nazir who is a Nazir Oilom, a permanent Nazir, nevertheless, the Nazir would be the one who will take care of the dead, be metame, rather than the Kohen. Although he's a permanent Nazir, but nevertheless, it was a introduced prohibition as opposed to a Kohen that is inherited, and it's a built-in type of a prohibition that is moving in inheritance just by him being of the tribe of Levi and from the family, from the descendants of Aaron a Kohen. Sometimes a Nazir who became a leopard, he would be liable, or he will be committed to violate his prohibition, because a person at the end of the leprosy, he needs to shave his entire body. As such, the mitzvahs say, the positive commandments of shaving the entire body at the end of the leprosy period will override the prohibition of a Nazir to shave his head. According to the rule, where there is a esse and a loisa esse, the esse will override the loisa esse. And the Rambam is asking a very interesting question. We all know that the esse is capable to override only when there is only one loisa esse, only one negative commandments. But in our case, there is, in addition of the negative commandments not to shave the head of the Nazir, there is another positive commandments of Kodesh Yeh Gadel Perasar Roisho. Holy he should be, he should keep raising his head. So how come he is able with one positive commandments to violate another negative commandment plus a positive commandment? And the answer is that the positive commandments at the time of his leprosy, since the Torah was defining it with the introduction of Kodesh Yeh, holy he would be, he's not holy precisely in these days. He's not functioning as a holy, since, as we have learned before, that during the time of the Tzoras, he is not a functioning Nazir. So by him being not a functioning Nazir, the positive commandments that is involved is removed. And for that reason, there is only a negative commandment involved. And a negative commandments can be overridden by one positive commandment. Towards the end of our daily shiur, which is the Perek Shmini, the 8th chapter of Hilchos Nezirus, the Rambam introduces the process how the actual tiglachas tahare, the haircut that comes at the end of the proper term of Nezirus takes place. So basically he needs to bring 3 animals, 1 lamb male for oilo offering, 1 lamb female for a chatos offering, and 1 ram for shlomim. He must bring together with this ram also an amount of flour which will be able to make loaves and crackers of matzah in the amount of 20. The actual slaughtering takes place in the following order: first the chatos, then the oilo, and then the shlomim, and only then takes the actual haircut. There is a process of pouring the gravy from the actual shlomim on the hair and burning the hair right in the Ezras Noshim. Used to be in the northern east corner over there, a section where the entire process of burning and shaving of the Kohen, of the Nozil, used to take place. Then there is the Kohen helps him to do the waving, which is shaking the korbanos to upper, lemailo, lemato, upwards, downwards, and to all other sides. There is one situation where a Nazir is exempt from haircut in case that he's bald to begin with. And although you may think that since he's bald and he's exempt from haircut, nevertheless, he still have to go ahead with the korbanos. There is also a ruling that if those korbanos was a certain damage were taking place, and turns out that these particular korbanos were not done properly, or a pigul, or a psul, or not lishmo, so basically it turns out that the nozil was taking his haircut before the expiry date, because what really makes the haircut proper only when it's done after the korbanos were brought properly. For that reason, he will need to act precisely as a haircut took place in middle of his Nezirus term, which then, as we said before, he gotta wait 30 days, and then count another 30, which that's the idea. He needs to pay off 30 extra days until he will have pera se'aroishoi, his hair being raised again. There is, towards the end of the chapter today, the idea where by a male only there is so-called funds inheritance process, which speaks about a father who left a certain designation of funds toward his Nezirus. So although he dies, his son can take those funds that originally designated by his father for his father's Nezirus, but he will apply it to his own Nezirus, to the Nezirus of his son. And that's basically a summary of today's Rambam. Thank you very much, and Ktiva v'Chatima Tova for a sweet, good year, and Chodesh Tov. All the best.